Good evening to everybody from Mondo, from Estonia, and welcome to the speaker tour event of the I'm European Migration Stories and Facts for the 21st Century project. This project unites 7 partners and tens of sub-grantees from 8 different countries in Europe and aims to achieve a more open, inclusive, and peaceful culture towards migrants and refugees. My name is Kristina Mänd. I am the coordinator of this project and your host today. And in case you're wondering what those wonderful things behind me are, I am in the office of NGO Mondo, a development cooperation and global education organization from Estonia. And this is our wonderful art crafts from Ghana, Uganda, Afghanistan, Kenya, and so on, which we sell here and which are produced by many, many women for whom this is the most important social enterprise. Today's topic, climate change and migration, is inspired by the ways these two shape our present and future. Both create serious challenges and restrictions, but also provide extraordinary opportunities and smart innovations to the way we live, work, and interact with each other and our environment. Both have history, both have different reasons, both need regulation, and both affect our lives, attitudes, and behavior. Despite their complexities, though, we need to understand them, their synergies and interdependencies. Therefore, I'm super pleased to have one of the greatest minds with me tonight to look into migration, human rights, and the climates. Kumi Naidoo and I have worked together, I've known each other for 20 years and worked together in a citizen organization, Civicus, in South Africa, because of our shared passion for civic engagement and human dignity. In addition, Kumi has led Greenpeace International and Amnesty International and is currently the global ambassador of the Africans Rising for Justice, Peace, and Dignity. But for me, not only is Kumi the best person to have as a speaker on these topics, talks and discussions with him are always super inspiring and eye-opening. And I hope that you will feel the same. So welcome, Kumi. But before we begin, let me also say a few technical things. Kumi will talk, the way we do it is that Kumi will talk about 30 minutes. And after that, he's happy to take and answer your questions. To ask those questions, please use chat. Write your name and country or organization together with a question, and I will choose which ones to ask. You can also use the chat with the whole group, and the talk will be recorded and made available next week. So in case you don't get enough today, or you want to share it with your colleagues or friends or family, you're welcome to do so. But now with Kumi in Berlin and me in Tallinn, we welcome all our listeners from all over the world. And we had over 175 registered participants. So let's see how all that works out. But now I'll hand it over to Kumi. And first, Kumi, tell us a few words what you are doing in Berlin nowadays. And then let's go into the topic of migration and climate change.
Thank you very much, Kristina. Good evening, friends, colleagues. It's wonderful to be with you this evening. I'm in Berlin as a guest of the Bosch Academy, run by the Robert Bosch Stiftung. And I'm a visiting fellow for 6 months, during which time I'm reflecting on the question of why is activism not winning big enough and fast enough, and what needs to change, as well as I'm engaged in a project at looking at how to bring together the worlds of arts and culture and the worlds of activism. So that's what I'm doing in Berlin. And let me say that thank you, Kristina, for that very kind introduction, but an introduction like that puts a person under pressure. And I should be very honest with all of you that I am much more nervous these days when I speak in front of an audience, and perhaps the best way I can express it is through a story. I was speaking to some folks in the United States a couple of years ago, and I was looking at how inequality was deepening, how conflict was rising, how forests were disappearing, how oceans were being destroyed, and so on. And at the end of the speech, a rather concerned delegate put up her hands and said, "Dr. Naidoo, have you heard of Martin Luther King?" And I said, "Yes, he inspired me and many other people in my country when we were fighting the apartheid system." And then she said, "Do you know what his most famous speech was called?" Thinking that it was a trick question, I very gently said, "I have a dream." And then she shouted out very loudly at me, "Yes, it's I have a dream. But when I hear you speak, it sounds like you have a nightmare. The forests are collapsing, the oceans are dying, and so on." So I tell you the story that I'm very nervous, therefore, these days when I am speaking to people. But in the story lies a key leadership challenge for all of us, irrespective of what we are doing. And that is, how do we find the right balance between speaking truth to power, saying it as it is, talking about the challenges that humanity is facing at the moment, without trying to sanitize it and make it sound less serious if it is indeed serious. And on the one hand, but not doing it in a way that makes people feel immobilized and depressed and sort of almost feeling like, what's the point of getting engaged? But make no bones about it. You and I live in the most consequential decade in humanity's history. What we do in the next 10 years will determine what future humanity will have, or whether our children and their children will have a future at all. That is what is at stake. And obviously, connected to the climate challenge that we have are multiple other challenges that we already had that are being exacerbated, from poverty to disease, as well as the reality that today we have many people who are referred to by some as climate refugees. Now, let me be honest with you, I am not the best person with the technology, but I think, do you see that, folks? Evidently, it's the wrong version. Okay. Let me see if I can get this. Here we go. Okay, great. So today I was asked to speak to you specifically about climate change, migration.
Kumi, hold on a second.
We're looking at your speaker notes.
Speaker notes, not the slides.
Could you go back to the previous tab? The previous tab, you can close this one. Yeah, perfect.
Now it's perfect.
Perfect.
Go ahead.
Okay, that means I'll have to do it without speaker notes, but that's okay.
Maybe you could go full screen as well instead.
No, that was full screen.
Could you close the tab with your email, please?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay.
Is that okay?
Looks good.
Yes, great.
Go ahead.
Okay, so the world we live in today is one where we are seeing a convergence of crises. Some have called it a boiling point, some have called it a perfect storm, where we see multiple crises: the inequality crisis, a systemic racism crisis, a climate crisis, and much more coming together at the same time. And then to add on top of all of this, the COVID-19 then pull back the curtains on the failures of our current economic system, energy system, and so on. And I think in a way, COVID exposed a range of challenges that we face, and we can see that we are not as equipped as ideally we would like to be to face them. Then we also have the reality where the science is giving us a very dire and frightening warning. And they've been doing so for a long time, to be fair. It's just been ignored by our political and business leaders largely. And so, just to put it in a story, you probably get confused, as I also still get confused by people talking all the time about parts per million, degrees, and you probably heard 1.5 or 2 degrees and so on. So let me just say what that is about. So the science tells us from the time that the Industrial Revolution so-called started, since we started burning fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas from that period onwards, from that point and into the future, our planet can only accommodate a 1.5 degree rise in temperature. Now, I want to see if the chat function operates. Does anybody know where we are now already towards that 1.5? Can people type where they think we are? Are we at 0.1? Nobody's taking a chance to put an answer there. Okay, over 1 degree, 1.2, 1.1 to 1.2. Okay, yeah, most people are in the right. Okay, no, now I see some of the answers are not quite right. But it's really, all of you are in the right ballpark, sadly. It's 1.1 already. So now think about this, right? At 1.1, we are already seeing so many crises that people are facing, right? We're seeing so many extreme weather events, even in rich countries like Belgium and Germany. We're seeing people dying from, flooding and other extreme weather events. So the question is, as we get to 1.2, as we get to 1.3, how will the, catastrophe increase? So to be blunt about it, we are in bad shape and we need to play catch up here. And one of the consequences, oops. Do you still see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So one of the main reasons I suggest is that we are not moving forward is that we do not connect the different crises that we face, right? That we treat the economic crisis when it happens as if it's something that stands on its own. We treat the environmental crisis as it's something on its own. And sadly, even the organizations fighting for justice on these issues also fall into the trap, with Amnesty and Human Rights Watch on human rights, and then WWF and Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace on environment and so on and so forth. When all of these issues are intersecting and need to be understood. So intersectionality is a gift, actually, conceptually, that was given to us by the feminist movement decades ago. And it speaks to the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to an individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So if we are to move forward, I am arguing, to address migration or any other issue, one part of what we need to do is break down the silos that exist in our minds, our worlds, and in our work, understand the nexus or the connection between the various crises that we are facing, and use these perspectives to forge new pathways to justice that are embracing an understanding of the intersectionality of the world's problems. This is almost, I believe, a critical success factor if we are to make the kind of progress and catch up, as I say, we need to make if we are to secure human life on this planet. And just to be clear, you probably have heard people like myself saying at some point, save the planet, save the planet, save the planet. The good news is, for everybody who's worried about saving the planet, is that the planet does not need saving. In the sense that if we continue on the way that we are, the end result is we warm up the planet to the point where we cannot produce food, we erode our water resources, our soil is decimated, and so on. And the end result is we will be gone, the planet will still be here. And the truth is, once we become extinct as a species, the forests will grow back, the oceans will recover, and so on. So, tongue in cheek, let me say that the struggle to avert catastrophic climate change and address the problems that stem from it, like migration, are fundamentally the struggles to protect our children and their children's futures. That's what is at stake here. So climate change is affecting human lives and will cause human rights violations across the world in many forms. And climate change is also, sadly, an issue of climate apartheid. As you probably have heard, there's a term that is used now called vaccine apartheid, where most rich country governments, against the wishes of their own citizens, it would appear, are hoarding vaccines and so on, when it's actually in the self-interest of everybody that everybody is vaccinated. So we are all safe when we are all vaccinated. Otherwise, you get variants. Similarly with climate, we have this issue of the parts of the world that contributed most to the problem and are not the ones that are paying the first and most brutal price from climate impacts. And then when we look at climate change and migration specifically, the most important thing to know is climate change is not a celebratory act. It's not usually done out of some big celebration. It is usually an act of last resort. And soon, I believe, the main sort of driver of migration will in fact be the impacts of climate change. So sadly, dominant nations and fossil fuel companies have delayed action on climate for far too long. And this, in reality, increases in climate migration is therefore a consequence of this historical neglect. As Professor Flinterman puts it, as climate change causes millions of people to migrate, their rights must urgently be enshrined in and protected by international law. The problem is the current legal framework, which is very much refugee law that was developed actually to support the people of Europe after the Second World War in particular, is inadequate to deal with the problem of climate refugees, in the sense that there isn't actually a legal categorization called climate refugee to start with. And then is focused really on torture, discrimination, and so on. And this statement by Professor Flinterman is a call that this is something that we need to figure out how to deal with urgently, because like it or not, we are going to have millions of people who are not going to be able to live in their homes as a result of the impacts of climate change. And the sad reality is many of the people that face this choice first are the ones that have contributed least to the problems of climate change. These are not the folks that are driving cars or have ovens and microwaves and fancy televisions and so on. These often are rural folk in remote areas who sadly are paying this first and most brutal impact of climate change. So what vision do we need moving forward? I guess the vision ideally we would like is equitable and just migration. Clearly, it would be better if migration was not happening, but it is. We must ensure that we have just and equitable processes that are not reproducing some of the horrible situations that refugees face and the uncertainty that host communities face because governments are not being clear and so on. And in reality, we have to begin to say that migration must be planned, funded, and equitable. The European Union, for example, would like to say that they plan for these eventualities, it has some measure of funding, but I don't think they can claim that it is being done in as equitable a way as possible. So what are the solutions for addressing the migrant challenge, right? The migration challenge. So to answer that question, I just want to say that we need to take a bigger view of how we deal with climate and the other issues that are leading us to a situation where so many people feel the need to leave their homes. So in terms of what we need to do, the first thing we need to do is begin to resist cognitive dissonance. This is basically about resisting the fact that our governments and business are in denial that humanity is so close to the climate cliff as we are, right? And the truth is, I used to be the head of Greenpeace and Amnesty International. As Christina mentioned, I had opportunity to meet very many heads of governments and so on. And when in those conversations with them, they agree as much as you and I would agree that we are in deep crisis, we need to change and so on. But they all seem to have the attitude, well, it's not for me to make the first move, it's somebody else, somewhere else to make the first move. And I know for sure, and you should feel comfortable knowing that they have access to the better information and data from the scientists about how bad things are. The second thing we have to do is commit to creative maladjustment. So let me tell you what I'm meaning. I'm just throwing three concepts at you to provoke some response, right? So the second one is committing to creative maladjustment. What do I mean by that? Martin Luther King, speaking in 1965, said, "My friends, as I come to the end of my speech, I want to note that in the field of modern child psychology, there's a very dominant term called maladjusted." Now, all of us want to live a well-adjusted life and not suffer from schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. But my friends, I say to you, there are certain things in our world that are so unjust and immoral that good, decent people should refuse to be well-adjusted to. So, he then goes on to say, "I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry, racial discrimination." And on the economy, he said, "I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few, while millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society," unquote. In a longer version of the speech, he then says, "I call upon decent men and women around the world to come together to set up a new global movement to be known as the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment." So what I am saying to you is right now, the most important thing I can share with you from more than 40 years of activism is to say to you that my generation does not have the answers to what we need to do moving forward. That in fact, we need the freshness and the perspective of young people like yourselves to not feel that it's okay when people like myself of my generation say young people are leaders of tomorrow. What we need is for young people like yourselves to step forward and say, hang on a minute, if we say young people are the leaders of tomorrow and we wait for tomorrow, there might not be a tomorrow for us to lead. And young people need to actually have a mentality of leadership right now, because what is needed more than anything else is fresh perspectives on old intractable problems, migration being one of them. And yeah, Albert Einstein, I wanted to just bring in because he once said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting to get a different result. So we have been dealing with problems of poverty and inequality and so on for a long time. And these are the factors together with climatic changes that have pushed the need for people to leave their homes. And I just want to say, speaking from my own experience, when I was faced with this decision when I was 22 years old of having to flee my country, South Africa, into exile, it wasn't an easy decision. You worry about things like, will I ever be able to come back home, family, friends, familiarity, the bad smells, the good smells, the everything, Nobody wants to leave home, right? And nobody wants a situation where they cannot go home at all. And with climate change, it's not simply that you leaving home. Your home is actually leaving you as well, as we are seeing in certain parts of the world already. So I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, shortly before he sadly passed away. I was then setting part of an effort to set up an African-wide social movement called Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity. And he was urging me to make sure that Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity would take migration as an issue seriously. Bearing in mind that most migration, by the way, that happens is within regions. So like, for example, if you want to talk about big scale migration concentrations, I can tell you Pakistan, where there's been more than almost 2 million Afghan refugees for a long period of time, or in northern Kenya, where there's settlements like Katuma that has about 1.5 million refugees and so on. And so you were saying, you know, we need to really take this issue seriously, and this is where our humanity is going to be tested. And he then reminded me that when he was a young UN staffer, that he had a poster on the back of his door which said something similar to this: a bundle of belongings isn't the only thing a refugee brings to his new country, with Albert Einstein carrying it. And I think most of us know that Albert Einstein was a refugee himself. So the third issue that we have to deal with, which in intersectional thinking is not an obvious thing, but it's fundamentally related to migration question, is to recognize that the worst disease that humanity faces today is not the disease of COVID, but it's a disease we could call affluenza, a pathological illness where people have come to believe that a good, meaningful, decent life or happy life comes from more and more and more material acquisitions. And sadly, this is not the case, as most people actually do know. But the consequence of this disease means that we have horrible inequality, which is unsustainable and is part of what is driving us to climate catastrophe at the moment. So just to conclude then, I would say that one of the things that we need to do is to recognize that, notwithstanding all the negative things that people have had to deal with and endure, people still have power, still have creativity, still have agency. And if I can reflect on one of the failings of activism, I believe, is that sometimes activists focus disproportionately on all the things that people don't have, you know, how people are repressed, suppressed, marginalized, excluded, and so on, which we need to, of course, do. But if you do that in a way that doesn't balance off, well, even after all of that, what capabilities people do have. And in this infographic that's up on the screen now, I talk about harnessing our autonomy, where people have power as citizens and voters, as shapers of our own destiny through movements, NGOs, trade unions, as volunteers taking action for the public good, as enforcers of transparency and accountability. Then I talk about harnessing our creative participation, where people have power as custodians of ancient wisdom, shapers of values, beliefs, and ethics, and makers of culture and all forms of art. And then harnessing our wealth is critically important. We have more capability than we realize, right? Like, for example, when I say people have power as holders of bank accounts, in Australia, for example, in 2015, when the government was wanting to move ahead and build the largest coal mine in Australia's history, people mobilized outside banks in Australia for weeks and weeks and weeks. And eventually all banks said, we're not going to lend. And this project then was slowed down, it was reduced in size, and the struggle to stop it still continues, because this would be of huge consequence to the Great Barrier Reef as well as to the global climate situation. So I would like to conclude by saying, in what you do, always I urge people to do what my mom advised me to do, which was better to be unpopular and honest than to be popular and dishonest. The time that we find ourselves in, that we are all, as individuals, challenged to make some very tough personal decisions. And I hope that I wish you well and wish you courage in the decisions that you need to make in your lives, in your communities, and in your countries. And I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kumi. That was, I really, really enjoyed that last slide, which you had prepared for the Law Society in Ireland, and later we can share it with the people as well, and then they can see the way your mind works. But thank you very, very much. Let me be the first to ask a question, and I can already see that we have quite a few questions lined up. But tell me, in your experience, Kumi, what do you think are some of the approaches that we have done or we have tried to either adjust or adapt or even stop the climate for getting worse and migration? But we have dropped them or we have stopped them, but we actually shouldn't have. We should have kept that sort of continuity and not let it go. Can you think of any that comes to your mind that we just gave up too quickly? We thought it wouldn't work, but actually in hindsight, it would have worked.
If specifically with migration or?
Climate and migration, or that relationship.
Yeah, I think, well, if I understood the question correctly, I think that this is a time for innovation, and this is a time for having the courage to do things differently. Einstein himself had once said, to solve a big problem or a challenge or a crisis, you can't use the same thinking and frameworks that got you in the crisis in the first place, right? And there is not, and I think what's embedded in your question for me is the need for us to have the courage of investing in certain things and sticking with it and so on, right? But on the other hand, we should also have the courage when things are not working to be willing to abandon things, right? But the problem is, there are lots of things that are working, right? But they're not somehow sexy enough for policymakers. And okay, let me just give a rather disgusting example. Okay, so just before I joined Greenpeace in 2009, I was a visiting scholar at Uppsala University in Sweden. And so when I arrived there, my friend who worked for Foreign Affairs was going to come and take me for dinner, and he arrived a bit late. And he spent more time, apologizing for being late than the time that he was actually late, because folks in that part of the world take punctuality very seriously. And his apology went something like this, like, the Uppsala bus management company runs its buses on human feces. And we had a problem. Now, I didn't know this was possible. And those of you who don't know what feces might not translate, merde, shit, crap, poo, whatever, right? So I didn't, to be honest with you, this is 2009, I didn't even know this was actually possible, right? And so I said, what was the problem? He said, well, their municipality had run out of shit, and they were trying to negotiate from the neighboring municipality to get some shit, and they were wanting to charge for their shit as if their shit was special or something. And so basically the next day, being naive about it, I went there and I was like breathing, in the central bus station where the buses would go to see if there was any poo smell, No smell, nothing, the bus is running fine. Only problem is there was not enough shit in that municipality. So I've been saying to African leaders, when I discovered that a city called Bristol in England also has, a poo bus, as they call it. And I was saying on the occasion of at a meeting of the African Union in Addis Ababa, I said, I just refuse to accept that European shit is better than African shit, that we have to get our shit together and turn the crisis of climate change into an opportunity. And I tell you this in a funny way to make a more serious point, right? That we are talking here about building a circular economy, right? Where we don't, and you know, I don't know how it's in Europe, but in Africa, the disposal of human waste, you know, actually contaminates water sources. So if we use human waste to generate energy, for example, we get multiple winds. So I think what we need in our solutions searching as we move forward is looking for solutions that give us more than one win, right? So let's say, for example, if we start using human waste, right, as a source of energy to power our transportation, for example, right? And at the same time, we're also keeping our rivers and other water sources clean. That is the kind of thinking that we need, very much joined up thinking. And that's exactly what I'm talking about when I say we need much more intersectionality.
Right. Yeah, that's that you very well answered my question. But let me now go to our listeners, because we have quite a few questions lined up, and there are a few questions which are dealing with the role of the young people. You said that we need more innovative ideas, that probably those innovative ideas are not coming from our age group, you know, from the old institutions, but they come from the young people. But Andrei Novotny is asking, but what if no one is listening to the voice of the young? And he's bringing an example about the movement around Fridays for Future. It's amazing, but at the same time, it seems the you know, lack effective response from the mainstream politics. So what about that?
That's an excellent question. And I would just disagree with the sense that nobody is listening, right? I think that the outcome we got in Glasgow would have been worse than it was were it not were for Fridays for the Future and the young people and other people that have been standing up and saying we need urgent action. So the one thing that I would like to say to all of you who have yourself might have engaged in some form of climate activism, don't let anybody tell you that your effort is not making a difference, right? Because quite frankly, and on the other hand, we can't be dishonest with ourselves, right? So on the one hand, we can say, yes, it's true that we are not having as much impact as we need to be having right now, given that lives are being lost now, livelihoods are being lost now, infrastructure is being lost now, all of that, right? And things are going to get worse according to what the science is saying. So yes, on the one hand, you know, we are not getting the leaders to move as fast as we need to. But on the other hand, just be very clear, if it wasn't for activism, we wouldn't even have any hope right now. If it wasn't for Fridays for the Future and them standing outside the climate negotiation, I was there and I was in the march with them, but I also was at a point where I could see them, you know, looking inside and saying, you guys, blah, 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 blah for 26 years. Where is it getting us, right? So I think that, and I'll quickly just say one thing. We did not get the deal we wanted from Glasgow yet again, but what we did get from Glasgow is a very little talked about sign of hope. Let me tell you what that hope is. See, in Paris already in 2015, we were in a situation where we knew in the middle of those negotiations that we were not going to get the deal that we needed, right? So then we started working really hard and lobbying really hard. I remember being part of it, right? To build in a 5-year review process, right? That is to say that every 5 years we look at what the science is saying, what the new science is saying, what extreme weather events are saying, and then look at how we increase our ambition on how we do better, right? And so that was what happened at Glasgow. So in any case, even though 1.5 and below is supposed to be the target, right? We in Paris when you added up the commitments the government was making, it came to 3.8 or something. Now, after the 5-year review, we've brought it down to 2.7, right? Nowhere near where we need to be. But what we won at this COP was that review process will now happen annually, right? So for every COP, every year is an opportunity for us to win, to fight another day, and to, was it Alex who asked that question? That last question? You're on mute.
Yes, I know. We are having few screens. It was Andrei Novotny.
Andre, yes.
Yeah.
So Andre, my appeal to you is to recognize that without the activism coming from young people and young people coming up with fresh ideas and so on, we lose hope, right? When people ask me what gives me hope, I'm saying the fact that young people are not prepared to say that, we're just going to give up, right? And so, and quite frankly, you know, if you speak to the Secretary General of the United Nations, even the current one or previous ones, throughout their tenure, I can tell you, even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when you ask them, what gives you hope, you know, what keeps you doing these impossible jobs of trying to move the world forward in a positive way? And they always said, it's young people, you know,
right.
And don't allow any politician, any business leader, anybody else ever let you believe that your voice and your participation does not matter. Thank you.
Thank you. We have Enek Enreen Salong. She is a high school student from Estonia. And to follow up on the UN Climate Summit, she is asking, what do you think was the biggest breakthrough and the most crucial thing that needs to be changed? So let's keep a little bit on that line.
So I think one of the things we need to change is who attends these negotiations to start with, right? Let me do another question for an answer in the chat again now, right? Let's see, be ready to answer this question. Which was the largest delegation to COP? Anybody knows? The largest delegation. Maybe the host country, UK, China. Somebody says China. Okay, that would be a good to see. No. Okay, Harriet's got the right answer, as does Anthony Joseph. Basically, 503 delegates were from the fossil fuel industry. And then the UK government delegation was the second largest, right? And it was less than half of the, you know how crazy that is. That's like Alcoholics Anonymous having a global conference, and the largest delegation to the conference is the alcohol industry. So one thing we need to do is we need to start asking some questions around transparency. In fact, Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland and the former UNI Commissioner for Human Rights, she said it even more graphically. Greta and the young people were saying, oh, this COP is very northern dominated, white, elitist, and so on. And then Mary Robinson said, it's male, it's pale, and it's stale. Right? So we need to make sure that that who's in the room, how the world looks like, not how a colonial world used to look like. You know, we have to just come real with that. Then I told you the other positive thing is the fact that we can every year now keep saying those, we have to bring it down from 2.4. If next year we can get it below 2, you know, to 1.8 or something, then we means the next year. But bear in mind, these are just the commitments they made, not necessarily that they've done it, okay? So that's another challenge, that we have to make sure that there's monitoring mechanisms, that the changes will be made. But I'll just end by saying, you know, people talk about, oh, it's going to be so hard to make all of these changes and so on. I think young people need to get the world excited about how we're going to change this place, how we're going to make sure that we can have energy where the air is not choking us and causing unnecessary death, where we can have a transport system where people are not sitting for hours and hours in traffic trying to get to work, how we can have food that is more nutritional and less, kind of polluted and so on. And let's get excited about that vision. And if we did that, because the only way we're going to get those at the top to change fast is if those of us at the bottom push upwards as fast as we can. And I would say, including at the local level, engaging in setting up one's own projects, for example. So if there isn't a recycling program in your village or your town or your city, then push and start it up and force the city council to eventually take it over.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If there's no cycling sort of lane, lobby for that to be built. If there's possibility to plant trees in certain places of the neighborhood that have become bare and barren, and help build people's consciousness about that, do that. If you can do a micro solar grid in a community that takes the community off grid. So what I'm saying is, the worst thing that we can do right now is assume that we do not have options and we do not have power, right? That would be just giving up in a very bad way. So even though, I start off by saying things, there's Afrikaans in my country where I come from. We have a language that derives from Dutch called Afrikaans. And even though I know very few of you speak Afrikaans, when I say this sentence, I know that many of you will know what I'm saying. So I think we need to keep optimism, even if our analysis is that ons is deep, 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 deep in the kak. Okay.
All right. Yeah, well, I can definitely understand that. So I hope others could do. But let me give you another question then. Harm-Jan Fricke is asking also on the younger generation, but what he's saying is, how can young people be aware of the memory of change that older generation have fought so that they wouldn't necessarily make all the same mistakes? And then after that, I would continue with the questions on the current migrant crisis, but that would be the sort of last younger generation question. So how to learn from the mistakes and not to repeat them.
So I think in the question is the answer, right? We have to make sure that we look back at the history, look how, when change happened, our mistakes were made. How do we make sure that we don't make the same mistakes again? And how do we reverse certain things that we might have done in the past? And I think one of the things that the biggest mistake we made was accepting such vast levels of inequality, that when you have such high levels of inequality, it's a recipe for an unstable society. And you're putting people with very different economic realities, you're pitting them against each other. So, but what I would say is, and I say this as somebody who gets criticism from my generation. A lot of people in my generation say, Kumi, why are you so negative about our generation? I said, well, if we got young girls, for example, who are 14 and 13 and 12, asking this question, is it responsible for us to have children? Right? If you got young girls asking that question, then I say to you, our generation has failed, right? The fact that young children are having to ask that question and so on. So, and I said, my view is this is no time for egos and legacies and what. In fact, I was going to say to Christina, there's another way she could have introduced me rather than the very nice way that she introduced me. She could have said, this guy's been around for 40 plus years. He's been fighting the good fight. And quite frankly, he's been really unsuccessful because most of these things have not gone anywhere as far forward as we need to. So let's just be brutally honest with ourselves, where we are, and with how you deal with what you learn. I think, though, it's really important to just show some basic respect, especially where people have gave their lives for different struggles and so on, even if in the end they went and became corrupt or whatever. I think it's important for meaningful dialogue moving forward that even though young people have every right to be impatient and be angry with my generation, I think it will serve younger generation better if they had the discipline not to eat out in violence, not to be impolite and so on, but to create the basis to save my generation from itself, which is what's called for.
I guess, Kumi, the reason why I'm not saying that, what have you been doing in the last 40 years? Because I've been doing the same things, right? So, and I would say that you and I think where we come from, I come from Soviet Union, you come from apartheid South Africa, and yet partly through the activism of people like us, and younger people and older people, our countries have changed, right? And the same probably will happen with the climate as well. And sometimes things have to go really bad before they turn back good again. So I think, to answer your question, if you hadn't been doing in the last 40 years what you have been doing, you answered that yourself before, we could have been in a tipakak, right? Or in a deeper shit. So I would say that that's the question, or that's the answer. Otto Hudek is asking to connect, Kumi, your speech with current migrant crisis in the EU. It seems that after the refugee wave from Syria to Europe, Europe decided to close itself to asylum seekers. And I believe one of the reasons is the rise of nationalism and rupture between EU states every refugee crisis is bringing. How do you envision a solution to this problem? And a follow-up comes from my colleague Meelis. How do you see young people relating to this issue? So refugee crisis, countries closing up. How do you envision a solution, and what's the young people's role in this?
Well, this is the most difficult question of all, right? And there's a real need for us to change mindset and change consciousness in a way, right? And what Kofi Annan said, we have to remind people that when refugees come, they come with more than what they have on the back, is really important. Because if you look at Europe, even if you look at it from an economic planning point of view, Europe has a real demographic crisis, right? In the sense that you have a situation where you have growing elderly populations and fewer young people, right? This creates major problems for the economy and so on. And there's no question, just as the United States benefited humongously and continues to benefit from migrant and migrancy and migrant labor, there's no question that Europe needs migration as much as some migrants need to get out of where they live, either because of political repression or climate impacts. But how do we get that message to be communicated? I think it's the hardest challenge. And so why I'm very excited about young people getting actively involved in leadership of the struggles that we are dealing with at this point is that I think you all can communicate better, right? In the sense that, you put people like Christina and I and ask us to do anything, we probably will produce, the first thing we'll do, we'll produce a 4 to 6 page concept paper with lots of big words in it, right? You get 6 of you and put you all in the room, you're all probably going to create a meme or create a little video or create something for, what is that called now? TikTok. And so on, right? Which instantly leads, while we are trying to figure out where we're going to publish our report and when we're going to do the press release, you all have put it out on TikTok already, and the message is spreading. So one of the things is to really get people to rethink, how we understand humanity. In Africa, we have a proverb which says, I am because you are. It's called Ubuntu, which is a sense of community-centeredness. I am because you are, or put differently, a human being is only a human being through the relationships with other human beings, right? Because if other people didn't exist, we wouldn't have any identity and so on. And unfortunately, in too many countries in Europe right now, we have political parties who are actually consciously using difference in the way that Donald Trump blatantly used it, in the US to win political power, and is promoting fear and exclusion and so on. And that is why I earlier said that young people need to bring to the struggle a sense of excitement that we're going to build a new world that we are going to have children in, and our children are going to prosper. And we are not waiting for the current generation to destroy everything. And I think because what we have to, Mahatma Gandhi from India, he said, this planet has enough to meet all of humanity's need, but not all of humanity's greed, right? And I still believe that to be true. If we shared the resources on the planet equitably, right, everybody will be okay. The problem is some people are consuming far too much and to the detriment. If you look at which country today has the worst obesity problem, the United States, right? Supposedly the richest country in the world, right? So we need a little bit more intersectional thinking, and I hope young people can bring that. I'm sorry if I didn't answer all the questions.
Well, Kumi, we have 2 minutes left, and let me just, before making the very, small summary, let me just pass one last question from Teele Pehk from Rohetiger, a green tiger, to you. How do you care for your own sanity, Kumi? That is crucial in the work you do. Any tips for the younger people, for the older people? How do you do that? I know Kumi makes mean curry, and I'm sure that curry keeps you sane, but there are other tricks as well. Would you care to share?
Actually, thank you for asking this question. And in the spirit of you asking it, I will share with you my first interview that I did since I stepped down from from Amnesty 2 years ago, just recently, where I talk about this question of how I dealt with burning out myself and so on. I'll send it to Christina and Melissa, and they can send it around to you. But firstly, I just have to say, people like myself are, Christina, by the way, is good at this, I should tell you. But many of us are very bad at self-care, right? We really don't make enough time for relaxation and because there's always there's so much things to do. You can be working 24/7 and it'll still not be enough, right? Time. And what we need right now is people who are energized, are taking care of themselves, are contributing to the best of their ability. Yes, at moments pulling the long, the long hours, not sleeping every now and then. But generally, we need to make sure that people are having some sort of balance. But the most important thing is when I was involved in giving Fridays for the Future and Greta and the leadership of Fridays for the Future, the Ambassador of Conscience Award, which is the highest award at Amnesty International, I said to them, do one thing, please. Don't allow the Donald Trumps and the Bolsonaros of the world to have the benefit of knowing that they had the capability to deprive you of your childhood, right? Being a child activist myself, I started off when I was 15. I didn't know much, to be honest. The slogan at the front of the march was "We want equality," but then the slogan to the back of the march, the younger kids were chanting "We want a color TV." If I'm brutally honest, I probably wanted equality and a color TV almost equally at that point. Well, all I'm saying is that what kept us going, and what I urge all of you in whatever challenges that you have, is to keep a sense of optimism, right? To keep a sense of humor. That's critically important, So sometimes I tell some bad jokes and so on because I think it's important that we don't take ourselves so seriously, right? Because the good news is the burden of solving this problem does not rest with any single one of you. It's far too big. It rests with all of us. And the challenge for us is, how do we activate the largest number of people, right, to get involved in ways that they can have fun. Okay, I mean, going to prison is never that much fun, which happens sometimes as well. But having been to prison a couple of times, I can tell you that you learn things from that as well. So I'm not saying that going to prison is always a bad thing, but let's find creative ways in which everybody can contribute to the best of their ability. And the last thing I would say is, and this is a call to those of you who are activists who will become activists, it is okay if different people contribute differently, right? All of us don't need to, make the same contribution. And I'll leave you with a quotation to make this point from my younger brother. When he was in prison, he had smuggled out a note with my father, who was having a chance to meet him 15 minutes every 2 weeks. And it said, "I've come to realize that the progress of struggles for justice move forward, not because of the big sacrifices of the few, but the small sacrifices of the many." Thank you so much for having me with you this evening, and I wish you well in all the work that you do and in your studies and whatever the world throws in your direction. I hope you respond with a smile, with positivity, and with courage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kumi. And as you said, both migration and climate requires small steps, but also the mind shift that we have in our behavior and attitudes. And I think to take that along is really what you just said, is let's take it as an opportunity and with optimism, and convey that in everything we talk about and approach and present the cases. What you said, let's make it also an opportunity, not just a gloom and doom. And I think that's what you have explained very well to us. Thank you very much on behalf of everybody. We had very many people listening to you, and thank you, and give our best regards to Berlin, and talk to you soon. Bye, and thanks everybody.
Thank you, everybody.